Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or where you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show and supporting the station. If you have any questions or comments, you can send an email to comment@am950radio.com. So a couple of comments before we actually get into today's show, or this week's show. For next week's show, I'm having a conversation with Chris Courtney, who is a local estate planning attorney. And we're going to have a conversation about estate planning and why everybody should consider doing it. This is one of those areas where people are like, they don't like to talk about, things that happen after they die or, that kind of thing. So, but we're going to have a conversation. We're going to go through some of the things that, you need to consider, especially those of you that have children. So, just a heads up on that. This won't be any legal advice to you, but just general information about the laws in Minnesota around these topics like wills, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, what might happen in a probate court, that kind of stuff. So, my wife and I recently had some work done through her, and she, agreed to come onto the show. So that's what we're going to be doing for our next week's show. A second comment is my wife and I recently went on vacation to New York. So in the last couple of shows that you heard were pre-taped. I try and not to do like best of shows if I don't have to. So those were pre-taped, so they weren't really like talking a lot about present, issues going on, but more just general topics. We went out there. I have a cousin who lives on Long Island, and we've been planning to go see her, before COVID hit, and then COVID hit. We didn't go, and then we finally were able to get out there for about 9 days, and 3 of those days we spent in New York City. So if you have a chance to go to New York City, and I definitely recommend that you check it out. I mean, there's a lot, you may think there's a lot of people there and a lot of traffic, and I was a little bit surprised. There's a lot of traffic there, but depending on, where you are, we didn't see tons of people. Most of the time we were there. There were a couple times during some of the days where, there were a lot of people around, and, you had to, it was pretty crowded, but, otherwise it was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. So, driving out of town, it wasn't bad. I did some of that. I actually thought it was going to be harder than it was. As far as traffic, volume of traffic in town, that's another story. When you're in New York City, it's always a mess. But they have a lot better public transportation system than, we do here. So, we were up on taking the subway. We took a train, we took ferries, and they got a lot of Uber drivers out there. So, we got around, various different places, and it was a good time. So, that was on our bucket list of places to visit. So, if you have a chance, there's some spendy stuff, there and all that. But, if you can swing that, I definitely recommend it. So now after we got back, there's a lot of stuff that was going on. I purposely didn't take my computer with me. So, a lot of stuff, it was just, that I saw was through my phone feeds, but that was about it. So, but one thing that I did want to talk about here, and that's what we're going to open the show here with, is the primaries from Minnesota. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just a couple of the top ones here. So these are on August 11th, of course, and let's start with the Democrats here. Amy Klobuchar won easily for governor. That wasn't going to be any surprise there. Didn't have, really any meaningful competition. And even if there was, she was probably going to beat him anyway. But the Senate race, however, there was a little, that one, a lot of people were watching that one between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig. There were differences in their policies, and Angie Craig had a lot of money backing her, and so it got pretty snipey between the two of them, as time went on. So a lot of people were watching that one, and Flanagan, easily won that one. It was like a 20-point victory. I think it was like 59 to 39%. Now, I wasn't surprised that Flanagan actually won, but that 20-point victory, that was surprising. I mean, I thought it would be, closer than that because, Craig had the money advantage, and you would think that she would do, pretty well out in rural Minnesota because she's more of the centrist candidate. But, Flanagan did well out in rural Minnesota too. So, she won by over 137,000 votes. So, that's a lot. So, again, I've talked a number of times on this show about how I think it's, this is an election where the Democratic base is, wants more fighters. They want more progressive policies. They don't like the centrists. They don't like the, we'll nip it around the edges, but that's it. So I think people were looking at Flanagan's going to be more of a fighter than Craig is. And, Flanagan certainly, part of her campaign was, fighting back against ICE and all that. And I think that just resonated with a lot more people. And of course, that Laken Riley vote that, Craig took didn't help. And she could never shake that. So, plus, again, I think this year it just seems like more progressive candidates are getting more votes than the centrists or the corporate Democrats like Craig is. So, and then Flanagan won by 20 points, being heavily outspent. So just a couple of reasons why I think, why was it 20 points like that? Well, first of all, primary voters, which this was. So again, this was not the general election, right? This was a primary. So primary voters are typically those who are, pretty interested in politics. They read about it. They keep up with it. Some of them are like political nerds like me, and, I teach it. And by the way, classes start on Monday, so I'll be back doing that again. But those types of people, we're the ones that tend to vote more in primaries than in the general public. And, I talked about how Craig didn't even go to the DFL endorsement conventions because she knew she was going to lose. And, it turns out that, yeah, she did. She lost by 20 points. So, there's a lot of the people who are, heavily involved in DFL parties or follow politics, at least, who vote in the primaries, were pro Flanagan who had the endorsement of the DFL party. And plus, frankly, I think they liked her policies better than what Craig was doing or what Craig's voting, record is. So they wanted more bold policies, not this, small change, centrist stuff. So, and then the second thing was, I think she was just seen more as a fighter than Craig was. I've talked about a number of different elections, not just in Minnesota, but across the country, where the progressives or Democrats in general, who are seen as fighters, are doing a lot better than the centrist types. And we've seen that, last week when there was a lot of primaries around the country where there were some, Democratic socialists won the Senate race in Florida, of all places, over a centrist Democrat. So, you're starting to see, you're seeing this around the country. And it popped up in this primary between Flanagan and Craig. So, even with the money advantage, even with all those, I saw all kinds of negative ads that these groups put out against Flanagan, and just people just weren't buying it, And I think you're seeing that around the country too, where there's a lot of candidates like that Democratic socialist who won the Florida primary. She was outspent like $16 million, and she had less than $1 million, and she won. Right. So I think this election is showing that people just aren't buying a lot of these negative ads going after the progressives. So second election was in the seat that Craig gave up in order to run for the Senate. So this is Congressional District 2, which is where I live. So she couldn't run in that seat no more. So there were three Democrats fighting in that primary, which Matt Little ended up winning. And again, I think he won because he was seen as a more progressive candidate. I think he was a little more well-known than the other two. He had the endorsement from the DFL at the convention earlier. And, he won by 17 points over Matt Klein, who came in second. So, Matt Klein, he was a state senator who gave up his seat to run, and so now he's lost his state Senate seat here when he lost the primary. So, that was another one where there were some national, groups looking at how that turned out, because again, you had the progressive versus the centrist, and the progressive ended up winning that one too. Now on the Republican side, for Senate, Michelle Tafoya beat the Republican endorsed candidate, Adam Schwarz. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but I mean, and she easily beat him. So it's going to be, Peggy Flanagan versus Michelle Tafoya in November. And, you're already hearing the Republicans coming out with, fraud. You're going to see that in all their ads and try and connect Flanagan with all the fraud because, she was a lieutenant governor. And we all know how, much power lieutenant governors have, right? So, there's going to be some people that'll buy into that. But, if you're a Republican or Republican leaning, sure, you're going to buy into that. But there's going to be a lot of Democrats who are like, come on. That's just not going to work. But you're seeing it in all their, all the ads already. You're going to see that in the debates, right? I've seen it in a lot of letters of the editors that the Republicans are writing about, right? And you're seeing it in the press, especially the Minnesota Tribune, right? Who they're already doing their puff pieces on, Lisa Demuth who's running against Klobuchar for governor. And you're seeing some for Tafoya. And then I was looking at, they're writing some stuff about Flanagan too, but, and Klobuchar more about, Klobuchar's are more general, but Flanagan is like, well, how's Flanagan going to get those Craigvillers? How is she going to, not let the Democratic Party get divided so she might end up losing? I mean, the totally different, way of looking at these races. And this is not anything new from the Minnesota Tribune. And they're going to keep this up, right? They're going to do their puff pieces on the Republicans and say things like, well, Demuth was, Speaker of the House and she did all this stuff while she was Speaker. And I'm like, yeah, what did she do? The thing she's most famous for doing is not doing not having a vote on the guns bill. Right. But, the Minnesota Tribune is going to leave that part out of their articles about that. But, and then again, Demuth beat Mike Lindell, beat him pretty handily, I would say. And Lindell's out there saying, well, I'm going to pay for the recount. Even though he lost by, I don't know, was it 40,000 or something votes? It's like, okay, go ahead. But I saw some articles saying he should prepay because I don't know where he's going to get that money to pay for it. But one thing that I like to do when I see primaries is, turnout. Right? I keep saying you cannot poll turnout. So this is something that I look at as, well, what was the turnout for the Democratic Party in the primary and what was the turnout for the Republican Party in the primary? Because you can tell if one party has the bigger advantage over another, that's going to make it harder for the one that didn't have as much turnout, make up those numbers in the November election. So this was a record number of voters for the primaries this year, which is a good thing. So, the Democrats, the total votes for them, and again, I just took this from, I think it was Flanagan and Flanagan versus Craig, that one, because I thought there would be the most, people voting for that one. And then for the Republican side, I took it for the same Senate race. So total for the Democrats was 697,927 people voted. So this is, this is where I added all the, third party people you never heard of, but they still got votes. So I added them all up. And that's the number that I got for the Democrats. Now for the Republicans, it was 406,823. So that's a pretty big difference. That difference is almost 300,000 votes in favor of the Democrats. So the Democrats got about roughly 63% of the total vote. So if you extrapolate that out for November, the Republicans they got some work to do ahead of them. But of course, there's going to be a lot more. There's probably going to be a couple million people voting, hopefully, right, in the November election. So, but if these turnout rates hold, or even narrow a little bit, the Democrats are definitely, assuming they turn out, of course, are going to have an advantage. Because Tafoya, for example, she has to make up about 300,000 votes. Which she could do, right? If there's, 3 million people voting, let's say. So, there's certainly room for her to do that. But if Democrats again show up at the same numbers, 63% outvoting Republicans, well, that's going to be a good day for the Democrats. But they got to get out and vote. And that Tafoya is going to get all kinds of money. She's going to get all kinds of outside money, and they're already spending it for her. Right? So I went back and I looked at the last governor's election, 2022, where Walz beat Scott Jensen by roughly 200,000 votes. So, and I don't know if it was a double-digit win, but it was pretty close to that. So just looking at the raw numbers from the primaries, there was definitely more Democratic turnout, which you would probably expect in Minnesota. But, that it was good that it was a record number. So, but Democrats, make sure you show up in November. Initial polling has, Flanagan and Klobuchar winning so far, but, again, you can't poll turnout. Right? We can't take this for granted. Plus, remember that the entire Minnesota legislature is up for election this year. So make sure you go out and vote for that stuff too. All right? That is going to be on the line this year. And if we have a tie in the House like we are now, or only a one-seat advantage in the Senate, it's going to be tough. Again, so we don't want that. So, make sure you go out and vote. Make sure you get all your friends and anybody that make sure you get them out there to the polls. All right, we're going to take our first break here. We're going to come back. Gosh, I got to talk about Hakeem Jefferies again. I hate to do this, but boy, did he make some stupid comments. So I'm going to talk about that when we come back here on the other side of the break on the Politics Matter Show. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show. How civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. So, some of you might have heard this, that Hakeem Jefferies, he was on, I was Meet the Press. Yeah, Meet the Press on, one of the Sunday shows. And, I regular listeners to the show will know I've been, calling for him to step down, calling for Democrats not to vote him in as the Speaker of the House if, we win the election in November, elect somebody else, because I just don't think he's up for the job. And I recommend you go, if you haven't heard it yet, go listen to his interview on Meet the Press from Sunday. Or last Sunday, I guess, because it's pretty eye-opening. I literally found myself when I was watching that, telling him to just shut up, please. Just shut up. Like, don't go on these Sunday shows anymore. You're just making things worse. for the Democrats. Stop doing these TV shows. And the reason I say this is he's sabotaging the Democratic Party. And he's selling out to corporate donors instead of fighting for the base of the party. Now, why am I saying that? Well, because it's actions like this from Democratic leadership that gave us, Trump twice, is giving Republicans control of Congress right now and the control in the Supreme Court. And look where it's gotten us. Right? So it's actions like this sort of stuff that he's talking about. He's ignoring his own base of the party, and he's snuggling up to the corporate donors because, he wants to get paid. Or he's trying to raise money for Democrats for, around the country for their upcoming elections. And yeah, I know that you need money to, run elections. But if you look at a lot of these primary results, the people that don't have the most money, they're winning some of these elections. So I think the American people, at least, the ones who are paying attention to this stuff, know that, know what's going on now. Where, people, they're not letting them buy their vote anymore. They're just not buying what the corporate people are selling and corporate Democrats, frankly, are selling. So here's just a couple of examples of why he needs to just shut up. Okay, he was asked about, well, do you favor abolishing ICE or reforming ICE? And I'm paraphrasing there. And, knowing Hakeem Jefferies, of course, his answer was, well, reforming it, whatever that means. So, of course, he doesn't favor abolishing ICE. I'll talk about that here in a second. But, of course, his answer was reforming ICE. And then he goes on and says, well, masks, their masks should come off. Body cameras should be worn, and they need to get a warrant before they can, bust into people's houses. Yeah, well, that's not going to help, though, Hakeem, and you know it, right? This was part of the deal, in my view, the crappy deal you made earlier to end the government shutdown, where this stuff was supposed to be, was in the deal. But, as I said back then, who the hell's going to enforce this stuff? The Department of Justice, who is the federal entity that, prosecutes people for violating the federal laws. Of course, they're in the bag with Trump. They're not going to deal with this stuff. And you know it. ICE is still wearing masks. They're still not wearing body cameras, in many places. Or if they are, they're not turning them on. Or they're actually turning them off when they know things might get a little testy, right? And they're not getting warrants, judicial warrants. They're doing their typical, agency type warrants on some of this stuff. So, here again, he's misreading the base of his party, which wants to abolish ICE. That's what the latest polling is showing. I mean, there's even some Republicans who want to abolish ICE these days, just for what they've been doing. Yet, he doesn't have the courage to say, well, abolish it. We don't need it. I thought that's what ICE was for. What the border, Custom and Border Patrol is supposed to be doing. Remember that ICE came into being in 2003, so it hasn't even been around that long. But here they are, right? Murdering people in the streets, deporting lawful citizens, and letting people die in their concentration camps. There's been over, at least the latest count, and by the way, the administration has stopped giving data on how many people have died in their detention centers. But the latest number was over 50. By the way, the federal government just bought that prison that I talked about earlier that's in Appleton. They bought it from Core Civic. And as a result of that, Appleton, you're going to lose, unless there's some other way around this, you're going to lose about $800,000 a year in property taxes because Core Civic is selling it to the federal government, and the federal government isn't going to pay taxes on that land. So you're going to lose a big chunk of your, probably your biggest chunk of money for your budgets, not only in Appleton, but in Swift County. So just a heads up on that. That's something you might want to watch for. But, ICE just started in 2003. I mean, we've been able to do it without them since 1787. Why can't we do it now? What you have now is it's Trump's private criminal gang running around. And Jefferies is out there saying, well, we want some of these, BS reforms. I mean, let's call it like it is, that Trump won't follow anyway. There are people who have been disappeared by ICE, and Jefferies just wants to reform that. Hakeem fascism is here, as I've said before. Reforming ICE isn't going to help. You got to get rid of it. So, his answer there was just so weak, right? So, he must have forgotten what Minnesota went through this winter. But, that's Jefferies, right? Sucking up to the money. And then, so that was the first, issue where he really screwed up. And I was telling him then, shut up. But then it got even worse, if that's possible, where he came out and said, he was asked about, well, do you support Medicare for all? Because he used to when he wasn't speaker, or I'm sorry, when he wasn't the minority leader in the House. Well, now he comes out and says, no, I don't support Medicare for all. Even when, get this, in the latest polling of the Democratic base now, so this is not everybody in the United States, but this is the Democratic base. The polling is 90% support Medicare for all now. So you would think, as one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, he would say, well, yeah, I do. But nope, I don't support it. And we all know why, right? He's getting all kinds of money from health insurance companies and, doctors associations and, all that sort of, all the money that's in that system. Of course, he's going to say this because he wants that money. So he just, he could, we need to reform the Affordable Care Act, which to me means, again, when they start saying reforms, we're just going to tweak it a little bit. So all he said was, well, let's get those tax credits back that the, Republicans killed in the big, horrible bill. Well, yeah, but the healthcare system, Hakeem, before that was horrible for a lot of people. So even giving that stuff back, it's not going to get any better. Plus, healthcare, as I was driving over here to tape this show, is projected to grow about 11%, the premiums, next year. So even with those tax subsidies, it's going to cover less and less for people because the costs are going to go up. Right. So let's get those tax credits back. That's not going to fix anything. I mean, yeah, it's going to help people with their premiums, but the healthcare costs are going to go up. So they're going to have to pay more out of their own pocket, unless you really increase the tax credits. Which by the way, he didn't say he was going to do. He just said, well, let's get those ones that they got rid of. Well, fine, but, the costs are going to go up. Plus, there's still a lot of uninsured people in this country. They can't afford the ACA. I think he's missing that part too. So there was a recent study from Yale, I believe it was. It just came out about Medicare for all. And Hakeem knows this, right? It says that if we had Medicare for all, we would save $1 trillion a year. So it's better than the ACA, right? And 114,000 people, roughly, their lives would be saved each year. Because there's a lot of uninsured people. If they're not, everybody's not covered, there's going to be some people that are going to die. There's also going to be people dying because they can't afford their treatments. And, we've heard about people rationing their drugs and all that, and they end up dying, right? So for the study said there would be an additional 114,000 people that would be alive. But I guess that's not good enough for Hakeem, right? Tupping those people. And let's not forget that under the big horrible bill, 18 million people are going to, potentially lose their Medicaid coverage once that kicks in next year. I mean, there's already 4 million people that have lost it because of some work requirements in some states, Republican states. And we got rural hospitals are closing. And Jefferies just wants to, tweak the current system. The current system isn't working. He even acknowledged in an interview that the system is, quote, broken. Yet he's not going to, he's not going to change it. I guess saving $1 trillion a year isn't of interest to him, as long as he gets that corporate money. Right? So I have seen some polls that, again, this 90% is the latest one that I've seen. There's been some earlier ones where it was, I think the lowest one was like 75% for the Democrats, the base people want Medicare for all now. And even if you look at the polls for a majority of Americans now, support Medicare for all. It's not 90% or anything, but it's a majority now. But that's too far for Jefferies. Every other industrialized country in the world has some form of universal health care, but not the United States. This issue is another reason why Trump and the Republicans win elections that, on policies that they shouldn't win, but they do. People are tired of nothing happening. You're seeing this in some of these 2026 elections. This is why fighters are winning a lot of elections, a lot more than they used to. They're beating the big money centrist candidates, which, by the way, is pissing off the establishment. Talk about that here in a bit too. But this whole thing about, we can't do Medicare for all. I mean, Medicare for all is now the moderate position on healthcare. I mean, you got more doctors and nurses calling for Medicare for all too. But not Hakeem. And not Chucky Schumer, right, in the Senate. And I think this is one reason why Flanagan ended up beating Angie Craig. I mean, Flanagan was out there supporting Medicare for all, while Angie Craig was not. Now, Angie Craig was out there, I think she came up with some sort of single payer system or something, but she wasn't supporting Medicare for all, and I think that hurt her. Because the base of the Democratic Party now overwhelmingly favors Medicare for all, but not the Democratic leaders in the House and in the Senate at the federal level. Apparently they forgot that Flanagan won by 20 points campaigning on this stuff. And, you're seeing a lot of the Democrats who are running on Medicare for all are winning. Gee, I wonder why. But boy, this Democratic leadership is becoming an embarrassment. So what should happen here? Now, if the Democrats win the House, I'm guessing Hakeem Jefferies will be elected Speaker. Unfortunately, in my view, but that's likely to happen. But what should happen? I think all the progressives and all the DSA House members, because I think you're looking at some DSA people getting elected. Those people should band together and say, we're not going to vote for Jefferies. Use the power that you got as a collective group to either get rid of them, or if you don't have enough votes to, get rid of them, at least, get some concessions out of them. Like make him put Medicare for all up for a vote on the floor in the House. Use your power that you have to force him to do something. Because the status quo ain't working. So again, this is why I think you're seeing a lot more progressives win. In primaries, they're knocking off some of these centrist Democrats and corporate Democrats. But unfortunately, the centrist Democrats and the people, the campaign workers who or I should say political consultants, not campaign workers, but political consultants who, that's how they make their money. I mean, they're going after some of these progressives, like Abdul El Sayed, who won in Michigan over the centrist candidate handpicked by Chucky Schumer. That was Haley Stevens. They're going after him. The Democratic Party is going after their own, or the person who won the Democratic primary in the state of Michigan for Senate. Right, in order to win back to Senate, Chuck, you're going to need El Sayed to win in Michigan. And I know Schumer's already out there saying, well, there's other scenarios where we don't need him to win. It's like, you guys are actively sabotaging his, you were doing it in his primary, but now they're going to start doing it in the general election too. Plus the third way, if you've heard that, the third way, that is a group of Democrats, corporate Democrats, who are already saying they're going to spend $15 million to fight democratic socialism across the country. Because here's what's going on. The establishment, the consultant class, they don't like this. They don't like progressives winning because they're going to lose their power. They're going to lose their money. They're going to lose their gravy train if progressives keep winning. The establishment Democrats would rather lose to Republicans than have a progressive win, a progressive Democrat win, because that isn't, that's just another indication that the corporatists, the centrists are going to lose, lost a seat. And the more and more progressives win, the more and more power that they're going to get. So if too many progressives win, the establishment is going to lose their power and they're going to lose their money. And they don't want this to happen. So they're going to start trying to take out some of these, in their view, leftists, right? Or as the Republicans call them, the commies, right? They're going to try and sabotage their campaigns. And you're going to see some of these groups give money to the Republicans. So, more and more Democrats are voting for their progressives, and the establishment sees it, and they don't want to give up their power. And the only way to fight back, for us common people, is to continue to vote for progressives. Because what the centrist Democrats have given us over the years isn't good enough. And that's why Trump won two elections. That's why Republicans are in charge. So this is why progressives are managed, their campaigns are a lot on economic justice. Right? And they've been winning. They've been flipping seats. Right? We've seen some of that in some special elections. They just did that again in outside of Pittsburgh. They flipped another seat in a special election in their state legislature. I think people are tired of this do-nothing Democrats. And if you're a fighter, you're going to, and you come up with Medicare for all and other policies, right, that the progressives campaign on, they're going to do a lot better because this is now what the Democratic base voter wants. So please, Hakeem, just shut up. Stop going on these shows. We don't want to hear from you anymore. All right. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I did earlier. I did a show about how in the United States income inequality and wealth inequality is bad. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in this upcoming segment. So we'll see you on the other side of the break here on the Politics Matter show. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter show. I'm Bruce Klopfleisch, your host. So for this last segment, I'm going to talk about how wealth. So this one's based on wealth inequality, what I'm going to be going through here. So this wealth inequality is basically everything you own, not just your income that you get from your job, but anything you own, like your house or whatever equity you have in your house if you don't own it, right? Your cars, your bank accounts, your retirement accounts, and right, all of that stuff. That's what makes up your wealth. So that's what I'll be talking about here, not just your income. So I'm going to give you some statistics here about a report that I came by recently, which I think further illustrates how in the United States, wealth inequality is getting worse. And this report shows you some, gives you some data, and it shows how bad it actually is. Because, you hear politicians, all the time claim, oh, the United States, there's so much wealth here and we're the greatest country ever and our economy, is great and all this. No, actually, if you look at the data, not it is for the rich people, but not for us, right? Middle class is vanishing in this country. But you hear people all the time, well, all you got to do is pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And you'll be fine. Well, let's look into this a little bit further. And you might be surprised by this little bit of data that I'm going to be giving you here in this shorter segment. Maybe I'll talk more about this in another show. But one thing to keep in mind when we're talking here is the difference between average and median. Right? Because when you hear the press and the media, they a lot of the stuff they report is based on average numbers, but they don't mention the median numbers. So the average is basically right. You add up all the numbers and whatever, there's an average there when you take into account all those numbers. But the median, when you look at that, is like you split it in half. All right, where's that middle number? And when you look at a lot of these things dealing with wealth inequality, if you look at the median numbers, those numbers aren't good. It's not as rosy as people think. So the study that I looked at compared the top 30 countries in wealth around the world. All right. So let me kind of give you an example of the difference between average and median here as we go on. So let's assume there's 10 people in a room. All 10 of them have $1,000 in wealth. This means that the average wealth in that room is $1,000, right? They all have the same amount. So the average is 1,000. It also means that the median amount, the middle value that is in that room is also $1,000 because everybody has the same amount of money. So it's $1,000. Now, let's assume that there's a billionaire in the room. And then there's 9 other people in the room, to make up the 10 that have the $1,000 in wealth. So there's a billionaire now in the room. The average, so we're talking about average now, suddenly, right, shoots up to $100 million, if I did my math right. But those 9 people don't have $100 million. They still got their $1,000. Right, but you can see how adding one, real rich person really, skews the numbers. That's what happens when you do the average. But let's look at that example with the median wealth. So again, we're trying to find a midpoint, basically, there. So in our example with the 9 people with 1,000 and then the billionaire thrown in, right, to make up our 10 people, the median in our new in the new case is still 1,000, right? Because that's what the middle person, in other words, person number 5 or around there in that room, that's what they make. So when you look at the average, it's 100 million, but when you look at the median number, it's still 1,000. So when you add in these, rich people, that massively skews the data. But when the media is out there talking about this stuff, they usually go with the average number. They don't talk about the median numbers. So the data that I'm going to be talking about here comes from the UBS Global Wealth Report that they put out in June. So UBS is a major bank, major world bank, but it's based in Switzerland. There's UBS banks in the United States. Right. So they looked at the 30th wealthiest country. So based off those wealth numbers in the United States, we are number 2 when you look at the average wealth per adult in the United States. So they did all these calculations, and it came out to $696,277. So we're number 2 for the highest average wealth. Now, how many of us do you suppose in the United States actually have, we'll round it up to $700,000? Not very many. But you can see what happens when you add, all the wealthy people into this, the numbers skew, right? By the way, Switzerland was number 1 at 910,382. So we're not number 1 there. We're number 2, though, if you look at the average. But if you look at the median wealth amount, guess where the United States is in these 30 countries? Not number 2, not even number 10, not even number 15, not even number 20. We are number 28 out of 30. So when they looked at the median number of wealth per adult in the United States, again, this is just the median. So this is like the 50% and under. But this is like the 50% number here. In the United States is just under 69,000 per adult. So 68,988 was the number that they got. That put us 28 out of 30. Now, again, this is the middle number. There's a lot of people in this country that don't have $70,000 in wealth. The bottom half of the people in this country don't have 70,000, or they got under that number. Only Greece and Germany were below us. So the median number is 10 times lower than the average number, which is a huge difference. I mean, Malta is even higher than us. They're number 15. Canada was number 7. We're number 28. And by the way, Luxembourg, of all places, was number 1 at median income with $394,000. So what this means is you look at these numbers is like, yeah, there's a lot of, wealthy in the United States. But most of it is in the hands of the top 10%, not the rest of us. Right? So when you look at the median numbers, I mean, $69,000, that's half the people in the country are under that number. So that's just another stat showing you how bad income or wealth inequality is here in the United States. All right, we will talk to you next week about estate planning. So tune in then.